Welcome, everyone, to our presentation today from the State Archives of North Carolina, a part of the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources here in the state of North Carolina. Today, we're bringing you an America 250 event, Marching to Revolution, the year-long buildup to the Battle of Morse Creek Bridge. I am the head of the Government Records Description Unit here at the State Archives, Josh Hager. Joining me today in today's presentation are my colleagues in the Public Services Unit, Alison Thurman and Katie Crickmore.
Hello.
We just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar, and we will be putting it on YouTube eventually. So if you want to revisit it, you'll get that chance. So you don't have to write anything feverishly down in terms of notes. Also, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A panel. If you open up the Q&A, that's where we would like you to put your questions throughout the presentation. You can still use chat to communicate, but please put your questions in Q&A. We're going to answer your questions at the end of the presentation just to make sure we get through all the content we have to get through for you today. Next slide, please, Allison. What we're going to talk about today is the year-long battle the year-long buildup to the Battle of Morse Creek Bridge, and including the battle itself. Allison's first going to cover the committees of safety and how they sort of become a government for what becomes the Patriots before independence is ever declared. Then I'm going to discuss Josiah Martin, the last royal governor of North Carolina, and how he's trying to maintain control in a colony that is rapidly trying to get away from British control, and the desperate measures that he takes to try to maintain that control. And finally, Katie will take us through how those two different lines are going to converge, quite literally, on a bridge in what's now Pender County at the Battle of Morse Creek Bridge. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Alison Thurman, to take us through the committees of safety. Good afternoon, Alison. Thanks for joining us.
Afternoon. Thank you, Josh. Afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be starting today's program with speaking about the committees of safety and the pivotal role they played in the transfer from royal authority to provincial government in America during the early years of the Revolution. And the committees of safety in North Carolina, they were heavily involved with events in 1775 and 1776, leading up to the conflict between the Loyalist and Patriot militia at Morse Creek Bridge in February of 1776. They had been directing the activities of the local militias, and they had been keeping a close eye on Loyalist activity in their communities for at least a year prior to that. They were also monitoring the activities of Royal Governor Josiah Martin and his efforts to raise a Loyalist militia. And so they were prepared to oversee the efforts necessary to keep that from happening. The committees began with a call at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774 for the colonies to implement a system of local committees to implement and organize and enforce the resolves and resolutions created by the Continental Congress, and then later the individual colonial provincial assemblies. They were created on a county and a civil level, city level, and comprised of locally elected leaders that met throughout the year. And by 1775, they were gradually phasing out royal authority and taking on more control of local government responsibilities. They could regulate local economy, politics, public morals. They were overseeing civil matters and criminal justice. More specifically, they could regulate price ceilings on dry goods and military items. They could hand down punishments for violators of trade boycott resolutions. They could require local citizens and merchants to provide military supplies on demand, such as powder and guns. They could also regulate the activities of the local militias, call for election of officers, and call the militia to action. They collected fees to send representatives to the continental and provincial congresses, and they also attended meetings of other committees of safety. They had the authority to question those suspected of Loyalist leanings, and they could hand down judgment and punishment for Loyalist activity. that could include public censure or property confiscation. And it's safe to say that overseeing the activities of the militia and monitoring Loyalist activities were two of their highest priorities. In North Carolina, there were committees operating in 18 counties and 4 cities from 1774 to 1776. The State Archives of North Carolina houses meeting minutes and correspondence of the Committee of Safety from Tryon County, Pitt County, Surry County, Rowan County, as well as the Wilmington, New Hanover County, and the New Bern Committee. And the activities of these committees provide a fascinating look at local politics and economics, military readiness, social morality, and just community relationships as they existed in North Carolina at the onset of the Revolutionary War. I find it so interesting to just read through them chronologically and see the patterns of how governing is changing and how society norms are changing. I'll just mention briefly that the minutes and the journals have been digitized. So you are welcome to go to our digital collections website in the Revolutionary War digital collection and read through them. And there's also a lot of transcriptions online that can help you get through that burdensome cursive. But they have been portrayed, the committees have been portrayed in popular fiction as sluggish characters, intimidating neighbors with violence and censure, but they really were so much more varied and complex in their nature. Rowan County Committee was one of the earliest committees in operation in all of the colonies. This committee oversaw the communities on the most western border of North Carolina. So Rowan County of 1774-76 was considered the backcountry at that time, as opposed to the longer, more established and populous eastern areas of North Carolina, such as Wilmington. And the original population in Rowan consisted of the Native Americans, the Saponi and the Catawba. But by the 1740s, you had Scotch Irish and German settlers, then later Quaker and Moravian settlements were popping up. Very distinctive communities along the Yadkin River and the adjacent foothills. By 1753, there was enough of a population to incorporate Rowan County. And the minutes of their first gathering began with setting out a set of principles known today as the Rowan Resolves. There are 17 of these resolutions, and there's a brief summary on the screen. In this declaration, they express solidarity with Boston. This is around the time of the intolerable acts that are going on. And they denounced oppressive measures imposed by British Parliament. The Rowan Resolves was one of the earliest expressions of colonial resistance to British policies in the colonies, and it was one of the earliest calls for unity throughout the colonies. Many speeches and writings of American colonists from 1774 indicate that their grievances over taxation without representation were with the British Parliament and not necessarily with the British King. Early hostilities that broke out over taxation efforts were blamed on Parliament's policies, not the actions of the king, although this would change beginning in 1775 and obviously in 1776 with the publication of Common Sense, then grievances start to kind of move over onto the king. But at the time of the Rowan Resolves, it's still the early article, the first article in the Rowan Resolves reaffirms the loyalty to the King of England and condemns the acts of Parliament taken on Boston. You can see the abstract on the screen. This sentiment was reflected to various degrees throughout all the committees and the minutes as evidenced by the image on the screen from the 1775 Surry County Committee of Safety Journal. And it's interesting to see the beginnings of the liberty or death slogan intertwined with the God Save the King motto. It's just an insight into how public opinion was evolving over loyalty to the mother country or to king and the call for recognizing constitutional rights and liberties. The Rowan Committee was heavily involved in regulating the activities and structure of the local militia. This was true of the committees of all of the committees of safety throughout North Carolina. The minutes on the screen from August of 1775 reflect that they had deemed Captain Oliphant unreliable in executing the resolves of the committee pertaining to the militia volunteers, and they called for the company to meet and select new officers. They also set out the number of volunteers that would make up the county militia and instructed them to be ready to march when called out to action. Many resolutions of importance to the various committees of safety were consistent, such as fixing prices on goods and overseeing the local militias and monitoring Loyalist sentiment. But it's interesting when comparing the minutes of the Eastern committees, such as Wilmington, and the Western committees, such as Rowan. It's really easy to recognize differences due to previous military conflicts on the Western frontier during the French and Indian War, French and Native Americans, the population demographics between the two geographical areas, and just the geographical topography itself. Inland committees like Rowan tended to stress frontier defense and militia organization amid perceived threats from Native Americans and Loyalists, whereas coastal counterparts also prioritize monitoring imported goods and enforcing the ban on trade from Great Britain and other ports. The Rowan County minutes also show that monitoring Loyalist activities was a huge priority. An example on the screen recorded in the August 1775 minutes details ongoing attempts to meet with the inhabitants of the Fork of the Yadkin to discuss opposing views on the cause of liberty. And tensions between the residents of this area and the committee members were recorded as early as September of 1774, that this area of the Rowan County, they were keeping their eye on them. This tension had been going on for about a year, and apparently they're still talking about it in their minutes. They're still watching that area. They were also monitoring specific individuals that they considered a danger to American liberty, as they put it, such as John Cook, who was identified as a Baptist preacher who signed the protest against the cause of liberty, which lately circulated in the Fork of the Yadkin. The committee minutes are full of entries identifying persons that they were watching closely for Loyalist sentiment and what measures they were considering bringing about. One of the earliest resolutions of the Continental Congress of 1774 was to ban all trading with Great Britain. The Continental Association resolution, as it was taken very seriously by the Wilmington Committee of Safety, and the minutes from 1774 to 1776 contain many instances where shipping and selling of supplies coming into North Carolina was closely monitored. The complexities of the interpretation of trade resolutions and the power the committees had in controlling the local economy are evident throughout all the committees in North Carolina. However, the Wilmington Committee was especially active in monitoring trade. There are many examples in the Wilmington minutes of decisions made on allowing imports into the colony. And on the screen, the minutes from March and April of 1775 record the committee ordered dry goods from Leith, received by locals George and Thomas Hooper, be returned to Great Britain. But as directed by the 10th article of General Association, however, in the second case, they determined that goods coming to Alexander Hostler from London may be legally sold without any breach being made in the General Association. So who can say today what criteria was used in determining what goods must be returned to England, or why some merchants fared better than others with obtaining permission from the committee to keep and sell cargo? But again, it's just so obvious what power they had controlling that economy. The ban on importing extended beyond just merchandise for profit. There are examples of property that was inherited through probate, shipped into Wilmington, but the committee ordered the cargo returned. So the intended person never received their inheritance because the committee would not allow the cargo to be unloaded. This is an interesting example of how the committees influence social events. Comes from the minutes of the Wilmington Committee of Safety from January 28, 1775, which read, resolved that balls and dancing at public houses are contrary to the resolves of the General Congress. It is the opinion of this committee that every tavern keeper in the town have notice given them not to suffer any balls or public dancing at their houses, as they wish to avoid the censure of the people. And on the screen, the minutes of March of 1775 reveal that the committee members sent a very important message to Mrs. Austen of Wilmington about canceling her upcoming ball. Unfortunately, there's no mention in the later minutes as to whether Mrs. Austen proceeded with her ball or whether she was publicly censured. But there's a lot of examples in the committee minutes going back as far as fall 1774 enforcing the ban on activities such as horse racing, gaming, cockfighting, going to shows and plays. Uh, these were serious times after all. There's no time for racing horses. An entry in the Wilmington Minutes from July 3rd, 1775, concerning Loyalist Allen MacDonald, relates that they suspect him of offering assistance to Governor Martin in forming a Loyalist militia. So this entry confirms that the committee in Wilmington was aware of Governor Martin's interest in gathering volunteers of Loyalists as allies as early as 7 months prior to the events leading up to Moores Creek in February 76. Allan MacDonald of Kingsborough, Scotland, was one of the most important Scottish Highlanders to serve the King's cause in North Carolina. He and his wife, Flora MacDonald, who was the heroine of the escape of Bonnie Prince Charlie following the Battle of Culloden in 1746, they settled on a small plantation in Anson County in 1774. And he was a well-known loyalist, which was not uncommon among the Scottish Highlanders that had immigrated to North Carolina after Culloden, the defeat at Culloden. They had taken an oath of loyalty to the king after that, and they weren't really eager to break that oath once the hostilities and kind of tensions began to become more prevalent in North Carolina. They weren't really that keen to break that oath of allegiance and to get back into conflict with Great Britain again. So it was not, there's a lot of Scottish Highlanders loyalists, obviously. But it's not known whether the committee members actually reached out to Allan MacDonald about a loyalist militia, but they were right to be concerned because we do know that he had indeed offered his services to Governor Martin's call for loyalist troops, and that would place him at the Battle of Moores Creek 7 months later. And we'll hear more about MacDonald at Moores Creek later in the program. The committee in Wilmington was very active in monitoring the activities of Royal Governor Josiah Martin, who had left New Bern in May of 1775 and was trying to govern from the ship Cruiser, which was moored in the Cape Fear River, not far from Wilmington. The committee intercepted letters and proclamations Governor Martin was sending throughout North Carolina, and they used intimidation to curb his authority and prevent correspondence with supporters and officials from other colonies. There was an uneasy truce initially over the logistics of the governor's presence in the river. They did allow certain visitors to go down and visit with him. They did allow for supplies and goods to be sent down to the ships. However, their patience with Governor Martin was wearing thin by early February of 1776, as evidenced by the message that was sent in the document on the screen dated February 5th. The Committee of Safety had passed a resolve that the cruiser sloop of war might be supplied with provision from time to time so long as she did not commit hostilities on the persons or properties of the good people of this province, but resolved that the ships of war now lying in this river have actually committed hostilities against the inhabitants of this province. And herefore, this committee, in obedience to the said resolve of the Committee of Safety, cannot suffer any more provision to go down to the men of war for the future. The entry mentions Fort Johnston. Fort Johnston was located near modern-day Southport, North Carolina, and the actions around that area in 1776 were essential in resisting Governor Martin's attempts to rally Loyalist support and form a Loyalist militia directly preceding the Battle of Moores Creek. And now my colleague Josh is going to talk more about Governor Martin and his time governing on the Cape Fear River.
Thank you, Allison, so much for that presentation on the committees of safety. As Allison said, I'm covering Josiah Martin. So she covered the Patriots, or what would become the Patriots, and their buildup um, in the years building up to Morris Creek, and how they're basically trying to run things through their committees of safety. But remember, there's a second government here, the official government, the colonial government, and it is headed by this man. Born in Dublin in 1737, Josiah Martin enlisted in the British Army in 1756 and became a lieutenant colonel in the 22nd Regiment of Foot. Martin married his cousin Elizabeth Martin in 1761. The couple then settled at her father's estate on Long Island. Martin resigned his commission from the Army in 1769 due to financial struggles, but his well connected father and brother worked to secure Josiah a high level commission. And when William Tryon received his appointment to the governorship of New York in 1770, the family's machinations paid off. Josiah Martin received the appointment to replace Tryon as governor of North Carolina. Essentially, Tryon and Martin swapped places, although Martin wasn't governor of New York. Martin met with Tryon in New York and then sailed for New Bern. He took the oath of office as the new royal governor on August 12, 1771. Martin's highest priority was dealing with the fallout from the War of the Regulation. Recall that Allison mentioned in the West there was context about battles that had already happened. Well, yeah, there was the Regulator War, North Carolina's own little war. While the Battle of Alamance served as the apex of the Regulator unrest, tensions persisted into Martin's time in office. Martin faced the legal and financial consequences of the efforts to combat the regulators. He received petitions from regulators asking for redress of grievances or for legal forgiveness for their involvement in the regulation. Martin also worked with the Colonial Assembly to pass the Debenture Bill of 1771, fancy way of saying that it allocated funds to pay for the military service of the militiamen who fought under Tryon against the regulators. Josiah Martin was the governor-in-chief of the North Carolina militia through his role as the colonial governor. To ensure readiness in case of a regulator rebound, or to rebuff the stirrings of independence later in his time, Martin continued to make appointments of officers to the militia. The document you see on screen is from the colonial governor's papers and is just such an appointment of a William Palmer to the rank of colonel in the Beaufort County Militia circa October 1772. Beyond the military issues, Martin's other issues he was dealing with in office were also legacies from Tryon's years in office. There was an expensive dispute with South Carolina about the boundary line. There were legal disputes over court bills, or court proceedings, I should say, particularly as they related to the property of debtors who had never stepped foot in North Carolina. There was a procedural kerfuffle in the House of Commons about its quorum, which caused significant disagreements between the House and the governor. And the Colonial Assembly opposed selections of government personnel by the Crown rather than through their own input. Essentially, even the people that are in the Colonial Assembly are saying that people in London shouldn't have authority to say who's running the day-to-day operations under Martin in North Carolina. None of these issues were resolved during Martin's term. As you might expect, the events of 1776 kind of just put all these things on the back burner. But what signs in Josiah Martin's papers exist that revolutionary fervor was on the horizon? Not as many as you might think, simply because most of Martin's papers that we have here in our collection predate the major break of the House with the governor in between 1774 and 1775. However, we can clearly see how much Martin had to govern as an agent of the Crown, or at least the government in London, as opposed to through his own judgment, his own sovereignty, or so to speak. Martin issued several proclamations on behalf, or more accurately, at the behest of King George III. One such proclamation directed North Carolinians how to pray for the royal family at each church service, which was kind of an overstep that likely rankled the North Carolinians who worshipped outside the boundaries of the Church of England. But a more telling symbol is the one you see on screen. This is a letter from William Lega, the second Earl of Dartmouth and namesake of Dartmouth University, to the governors of North Carolina. He was serving as the Secretary of State for the colonies. Through Earl Dartmouth's pleasant, flowery language, he essentially was trying to minimize how much Martin and other provincial governors like him could communicate directly with the royal government. He first instituted in 1768 his office, the Secretary of State for the colonies, was the official liaison between North America and King George III. Unlike prior colonial governors, Martin did not have a direct line of communication with the king. Everything had to go through Lega. In fact, let's look at his second paragraph here that I have outlined on the screen. It will give me great satisfaction to be able to fulfill His Majesty's gracious intentions in this appointment, and as it is His Majesty's pleasure that for the future should be addressed to me, I shall not fail to lay them immediately before the king, and to transmit to you such orders as His Majesty shall think fit to give thereupon. Translation: nothing gets to the king through me, and you must make every decision after you talk to me. So basically, he's saying Martin's nothing more than a middleman, which is annoying now, but consider how annoying it would have been in 1772 when it took months to hear back from your boss as to what decision you should make. This bureaucratic organization would show itself completely unable to adapt to the swift changes that are going to be coming from the committees of safety. In August 1774, Speaker of the House of Commons John Harvey convened a provincial Congress against the governor's wishes. That Congress elected delegates to the First Continental Congress and began the committees of safety, which we heard about earlier. Martin's authority would never recover from this act of erosion. 1 year later, in April 1775, Martin addresses the Colonial Assembly, and he told them that they had to uphold their authority in the name of the crown. Quote, "Be it your glory, gentlemen, so record to latest posterity that at a time when the monster sedition dared to rear its impious head in America, the people of North Carolina, inspired with a just sense of their duty to their king and country, and animated by the example of its legislature, stood among the foremost of His Majesty's subjects to resist his baneful snares and to repel the fell invader of their happiness." His speech is at once a clarion call for unity and the last grasp at asserting his authority over a legislative body and a colony that was ready to go in an entirely new direction. As much as Martin's passionate call to resist the baneful snares may have held sway over folks that would become Loyalists in 1776, Martin also recognized the tenuousness of his position. At the end of his speech, Martin told the assembly that he planned to strengthen Fort Johnston, who we heard about earlier, at the mouth of the Cape Fear River near Brunswick Town. But his call was not simply a matter of naval policy. He anticipated that his next step was to flight to the fort, and fly there he did. In May 1775, Martin sent his family back north to Long Island and absconded from the governor's palace in Newbern. He left behind most of his material possessions, which were eventually auctioned off after statehood. The property, he took a land route while incognito to Cross Creek, from where he sailed down to the Cape Fear to Fort Johnston in Brunswick County, which is now, Martin did not have a chance to set up a strong foundation at Fort Johnston, however, as the baneful snares rose in open rebellion. A group of Whigs led by John Ashe and Cornelius Harnett, both namesakes of their counties, Ashe and Harnett, attacked Fort Johnston in an attempt to capture Josiah Martin. Martin fled again, but the fort burned to the ground in the first act of violence against the British government in North Carolina. In fact, in 1778, one of the first acts of the General Assembly after statehood was to pass a bill to repair the fort and build it up as a barrier against the British Navy. And that's the document you see on screen here. Martin continued his flight to the last spot in North Carolina, or rather, right off its coast. He set up his seat of government on board a ship, the cruiser, anchored off the coast of Wilmington in the Cape Fear River. While the surging Whigs clearly had other interests besides placating the royal governor, The Halifax resolves, the Declaration of Independence are all still a few months away at this point. These few months are even stranger than the period during which Martin gave his speech. We can see here in this passage that what Alison talked about earlier, a strange tension between the fact that there's open rebellion and they're still trying to handle normal procedures. In this passage, John Hunt was allowed to go down to His Excellency, the governor, on board the cruiser to obtain such papers from the governor that he may have occasion for from the registrar's office. The implication here is that despite the fact that Martin recently escaped an attempt on his life, which simultaneously destroyed the most formidable British fort in North Carolina, the members of the Committee of Safety still needed Martin's signature for day-to-day legal affairs, the kind of papers that he would put in the registrar's office. Think land grants, deeds, things like this. Consider the kind of dissonance this situation produces. The Whigs are saying, we want you gone, or maybe even dead, but in the meantime, can you just sign right here to give Bill his land? How strange is this? I mean, if anything, it asserts the need to assert routine and normalcy, even in the most unusual of circumstances. But this bizarre balance would not hold. Martin wanted to regain his full authority and quell the monster of sedition, as he called it. From the decks of the cruiser, Martin worked to assemble a force of Highland Scots to make their way from Cross Creek to Wilmington to meet up with the British Navy and assist in the recapture of the colony. On February 22nd, 1776, that force encountered a Patriot army at Moore's Creek Bridge. We'll hear more about what happened there in just a second. But by May, Martin left the Cape Fear River to assist the British in Charleston. Later that summer, he was back in Long Island to care for his family. What essentially happens here? On January 10th, 1776, Martin issues the order to Donald MacDonald to raise a Loyalist militia, which he described as regulators and Highland banditti, completely inaccurate, of the Loyalists, of the Patriots, by the way, to converge on Wilmington. We'll see from Katie in just a minute how that works out. The captain of the cruiser tried to establish contact with the troops, but it didn't work. He tried cannon signals, but the militia was delayed by 2 weeks, so they never heard it. But in this weirdness of a battle on the horizon, Martin is still being demanding. In fact, he says that the people of Wilmington must provide flour to everybody who's living on the cruiser. That doesn't happen either. I do want to give a credit here to Vernon O. Stumpf, whose monograph, Josiah Martin, the Last Royal Governor of North Carolina, provided some of the information for filling in this timeline. Ultimately, Josiah Martin was a governor who was caught in the winds of revolution and who was unable, because of the bureaucracy set up and the swiftness of the changes, to respond to what was going on. The Battle of Moore's Creek may have been the death knell of Martin's administration, but he was already losing his power long before that, as I've shown in this presentation. But Moore's Creek was the most important event. And to turn it over to find out more about what happened actually at Moore's Creek, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Katie Crickmore.
Thank you, Josh. Share my screen. So yes, as was set up for us, the Battle of Moore's Creek Bridge was a crushing blow to Governor Martin and the Loyalist force in North Carolina, who fully believed up until then that the Patriot uprising could be squashed with little effort by only using the backcountry Loyalist in the western portion of the state. This group tended to be more loyal to Britain, partially because they lived in more remote areas, and so had a greater reliance on British trade and protection against raids by American Indians. They also were often more recent transplants from Great Britain, so while all American colonists were British subjects at this time, their connection to the British was stronger in general. These more recent settlers included Scots-Irish, Welsh, and other non-British transplants from Germany, but the Highland Scots made up the largest portion of the backcountry Loyalists during the Revolutionary War. As Josh explained, Governor Martin was well aware of this potential force, In early June of 1775, Donald MacLeod from New York wrote to Martin asking permission to form a company of Highlanders in North Carolina for the British. As per the Wilmington Committee of Safety minutes that Alison mentioned, Allan MacDonald had visited Martin around the same time and also offered to raise a battalion of Highlanders. Governor Martin himself even wrote to the Earl of Dartmouth in London requesting permission to regain his military rank and put together a Loyalist force, which he estimated could be 1,000 to 3,000 strong. By early 1776, based on these estimates, plans had been put in motion by British General Henry Clinton to send 2,000 British troops to the southern colonies, with one ship being directed to the coast of North Carolina to drop off arms to the waiting Loyalist army there. It was at this time that Governor Martin issued his January 10th proclamation to recruit a Loyalist force to put down the rebellious activity. He also name-dropped several prominent men in the Scottish Highlander community to focus their recruitment efforts there, due to his confidence in their loyalty, courage, prudence, and fidelity. Among these were Allan MacDonald, who was made captain, and Donald MacLeod, who had previously sent a New York petition earlier. He had traveled down from New England along with Scottish Brigadier General Donald MacDonald. Those were both sent by British General Thomas Gage to organize and lead this potential force. Martin wanted this force to be mustered and organized by February 15th, since the British ship would likely arrive around mid-February, and he chose Cross Creek as the mustering location. Cross Creek is modern-day Fayetteville, basically, which would be fairly close to the planned meeting place on the Brunswick County coast. Martin had already sent a scout to Cross Creek in early January who reported back that they would be able to raise and equip about 1,000 Scots and 5,000 Regulators. As we heard a little bit about earlier, former Regulators were individuals who had participated in North Carolina's War of Regulation a few years prior in the late 1760s into 1771. A lot of the western region of North Carolina was opposed to the tax inequality that benefited the more affluent eastern North Carolinians at that time, along with several other issues. But after the Regulators were defeated by former Governor Tryon's forces, many remained in opposition to the eastern portion of the state, and they tended to lean more Patriot. So Martin's scout, Alexander McLean, also he reported about 6,000 men willing to join up in early January. But by the time the Highlander leaders had mustered at Cross Creek, they were only able to gather about 1,500 total. What's more, only a small portion of the troops had muskets or rifles, so they were not very well armed. And that wasn't all. By the time the Highlanders had organized everything and journeyed to Cross Creek, North Carolina's Provincial Congress had caught wind of their plans and sent their 1st North Carolina Regiment of the Continental Army, led by Colonel James Moore, to intercept the Highlanders. Colonel Moore's army was diverted from Wilmington, which, according to the minutes from the Wilmington Committee of Safety, they were worried about being occupied by the Loyalist force, since it was right in the path of their proposed march. Other local committees of safety also directed General Richard Caswell and Alexander Lillington to send their militia units from New Bern and Wilmington, respectively, to assist Moore. You can see these movements tracked here on this map in our collection, which was put together in 1941. Moore and his troops camped at Rockfish Creek, about 7 miles from where the Loyalists were mustering, and they lay in wait. I've zoomed into the map and marked their camp with the blue X here. By February 18th, Donald MacDonald and his Loyalists had left Cross Creek, heading southeast towards the coast, and on February 20th, they had crossed the Cape Fear River and encountered Moore's force, which I've marked with the red X here. Reports at this time stated that the Loyalist group had shrunk to about 800, and Moore's troops were nearing 2,000. At this point, interestingly enough, a man named Farquhar Campbell began spying and supplying information to both sides. His reports convinced Donald MacDonald not to engage with Moore's larger force, and instead, he chose a different route. MacDonald redirected his Loyalists across the South River towards Corbett's Ferry, a crossing point on the Black River in New Hanover County, and they continued heading towards the coast. Moore's troops, with Lillington's militiamen, began to work their way down in that direction as well, but it was Richard Caswell's militia unit that ran into the Loyalists at Corbett's Ferry first. They had received word of the Loyalists' planned route and had already set up a blockade at the crossing. And Moore, hoping to cut off any alternative routes, had also sent some of his troops ahead to set up a position at the nearby Moores Creek Bridge, a little further south from Corbett's Ferry, which is circled here on the map. As he expected, when MacDonald reached the blockade at Corbett's Ferry, he learned of this alternative route across Moores Creek Bridge and redirected his troops there. Cleverly, though, he did leave a small group of his loyalists at Corbett's Ferry to pretend that the whole group was getting ready to cross there. Caswell didn't realize this trick until later, and then quickly followed. But actually, he ended up beating the Loyalists to Moores Creek Bridge. They set up their enforcements on the west side of the bridge, where MacDonald's forces would be coming from. But based on the terrain, they didn't have the best advantage there. I've marked Caswell's camp with the blue X here and put the bridge in orange. The Loyalists would be coming from the western side, where the red X is. Here's a photo of the reconstructed bridge from the National Park Service's Moores Creek Bridge Battlefield website. So you can kind of tell what sort of difficult area it would have been to camp out and to cross in general. When MacDonald arrived at Moores Creek Bridge on February 26th, he realized the poor position Caswell had placed his camp in and recognized their slight advantage there. So he sent a letter to Caswell asking him to surrender to Governor Martin's men, and they would receive clemency. He wrote, "I therefore in his majesty's name offer you and the officers and soldiers under your command free pardon and indemnity for all past transgressions on your laying down your arms and swearing allegiance to the king. Unless those terms are complied with, I must consider you as traitors to the Constitution and take the necessary steps to conquer and subdue you." Caswell declined to surrender. MacDonald and the other leaders of the Loyalist force had a council that night to plan their next move. And it was decided that the Loyalists would launch a surprise attack on the Patriot militia that early morning, with Lieutenant Colonel Donald McLeod taking command from Donald MacDonald because the older man had unfortunately become ill by the harsh travel. During the night, McLeod led the Loyalists to Caswell's camp, which they reached just before dawn. Unfortunately, Caswell had realized his poor camp location ahead of time and abandoned their West Bank position, instead camping on the other side of Moores Creek Bridge, which I've marked with the filled-in blue X. Also, to discourage any surprise attacks, they had already dismantled most of the bridge, removing the planks and coating the support beams with grease. This photo from our Conservation and Development travel files shows a photo of the bridge from May 1944 in a similar state. A sentry from the Patriot militia saw the Loyalists approaching from across the creek and fired a warning shot to alert Caswell. With that shot, McLeod ordered the Loyalists to attack, and they fired a volley towards the Patriots. McLeod and Captain John Campbell, another leader for the Loyalists, led a small company of swordsmen in a charge across the bridge, which, remember, was just support beams. The Patriots chose this moment to return fire, and both McLeod and Campbell were immediately killed. Several more fell into the rushing creek and were swept away. With this disastrous start, the remaining Loyalists immediately retreated, with Caswell's militia returning the planks to the bridge to give chase. A few hours later, Moore arrived with his reinforcements, but the battle was long over. A New York newspaper later reported that the battle lasted only about 3 minutes. We know a lot about the details from this battle because the outcome was so surprising. Martin, having been so confident before, had a lot of explaining to do to the British government, which he did in several letters, like this one from March 21st, 1776. He contributed part of their failure to the fact that he had originally been given the wrong impression about the number of Loyalists raised at Cross Creek, believing it to be 3,500 instead of 1,500. We also have a lot of firsthand accounts of the battle in our Loyalist claims records, written by those who participated, like this one by Alan MacDonald. He wrote that he faced General Caswell at the head of 2,000 riflemen when many of the Highlanders with some officers were killed and wounded and a great number taken prisoner. Among the latter was your memorialist, who had the honor of commanding that day, though unfortunate. It was reported across multiple newspapers and letters that the Loyalists had lost 30 to 50 men to the Patriots 1 to 2, and over the next few days, Moore and Caswell's troops were able to capture over 800 Loyalists who had fled the area, as Alan MacDonald reported in his claim. He was one of the many imprisoned for a time in a Halifax jail nearby, allegedly this one seen here in our postcard collection, before he was eventually transported to Philadelphia as a prisoner of war. His account and Loyalist claim are one of several in our British records, which is very interesting because it was technically a pretty minor conflict in the grand scheme of the Revolutionary War. Even so, it had far-reaching effects for how the war played out in North Carolina. The Patriot victory bolstered support for the revolutionary cause in the colony, and Loyalist recruiting efforts dwindled there for quite a while. American independence was declared just a few months after the battle took place in July of 1776, and North Carolina itself wasn't militarily threatened again until 1780. So that was how the Committees of Safety and Josiah Martin's flight led directly into the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge, the first Revolutionary War battle fought in North Carolina. Oh, did my screen disappear?
Yeah, we can see your meerkat, unfortunately.
Sorry.
So that's
Here we
fine.
go.
Let's pull up that contact us slide.
Yep, go right to the end. Oh my gosh. So it turns out when you're doing a PowerPoint and you accidentally click too far ahead, it just ends it. So
There we
now
go.
we'd like to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Katie. We've got some great questions already in the Q&A. There was one that we handled in the chat. Some people were asking if we're going to be putting this online. Yes, we'll be putting it online on our YouTube page. The digital collection site has been shared. Bell asked if there's any archaeological studies being done at the site of Fort Johnston, and Lorraine Umfleet, who's also with the DNCR, said there's plans to do some archaeological sensing or sensor work there. And also, she asked about the Wake County Committee of Safety minutes. Unfortunately, those don't survive. So we went ahead and handled those in the chat. There are some great questions in the Q&A, and I will go ahead and start with the first one that came in. This is probably a better question for Allison or Katie. Is there a listing of all the militia soldiers that participated in the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge?
Yeah, I can take this one.
I got the freeholder one.
Okay. So the militia soldiers, there are incomplete lists that have been done at this point because, like I said during my portion, we know which militia groups were directed to participate. And there were also several more that were listed as heading that way to participate, but just didn't get there for the battle. For example, the Mecklenburg County militia was heading that way, but just did miss the battle, so they turned back. And a lot of these lists have been compiled on websites, like Carolina.com has a compilation. I've found several books in the state library downstairs in our building that have lists of both the Loyalists and the militia groups and Continental Line groups that were there. So they've definitely been compiled places.
Thank
Though,
you, Katie.
again, it has been kind of incomplete. We don't know exactly.
Allison is typing an answer for what is a freeholder. So that answer will be coming up in just a second. The next question that's come in, do we have a list of men on the Rowan County Committee of Safety? So by the way, the answer to the freeholder that Allison typed, in North Carolina at this time, a freeholder was a white male owning at least 50 acres of land. That was the legal definition. So Allison, do you want to talk about how to find out if men were on the Committee of Safety?
Yes, I was, yeah, so I was, a list of the men on the Rowan Committee of Safety. That is something that has been compiled through secondary sources, I'm sure. We don't have a list that we have created, but the minutes themselves at the beginning of the meeting will list the members. So as you're looking through the minutes, which are very well dated, sometimes like in court minutes and things like that, you don't really know what day you're on the more you read into it. But they're very well dated, and they do usually include the members that are present at the committee meeting every time.
Thank you, Allison. I will say that we answered that live. The next question, is there a way to estimate the number of battles where it was Americans versus troops that were brought in from the UK or from England? It's kind of a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
There might be research out there about it. I'm not familiar enough with that.
yeah, there's probably research out there about it, but that's in North Carolina anyway. Um, there's a lot of there's a lot of loyalist activity going on, and so in the backcountry especially, you have a lot of not necessarily battles, Americans versus Americans, but there's a lot of neighbors versus neighbors, um, that I of different opinions going on back in there, but I suppose there's probably research on that.
And I would encourage that for questions like that we're not sure of the answer, our colleagues in the State Library of North Carolina have access to a lot more secondary research than we do. And I would encourage you to reach out to the State Library of North Carolina because they might be able to give you some great resources that can help you with that kind of a question. The next one that came in, are there embarrassing revelations of family who were loyalists during the war? I'll take out the word embarrassing, but we do have accounts of some loyalists from the war. As Katie mentioned, we have loyalists who are submitting records to the British government for claims after the fact. We also have a lot of loyalists who are no longer loyalists, who are still living in North Carolina and essentially are taking oaths of allegiance. And we have records of that in some county records. So they're renouncing their loyalist sympathies and are saying they're going to be loyal to the new American government. So not embarrassing per se, but there are definitely accounts of loyalists. I will say the accounts don't tend to get into motivations for why you might side one way or the other. Not usually, not the official records, but you are able to trace sometimes, people's evolution back and forth. Allison and Katie, do you want to mention anything on loyalist accounts?
I will say a lot of the after the war loyalist stuff, interesting stuff in my opinion, pops up in the colonial court records or district court records when loyalists who remained in North Carolina were trying to see what property they could get back after it was confiscated, because there were a series of acts that were passed confiscating property of loyalists who refused to take the oath. So there's a lot of if you're looking for kind of detailed accounts, they do go into it a little bit about like, oh, well, my property was so and so, it was taken so and so. So there's some interesting things that pop up in those records.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. As Josh and Katie has said, we do actually have a lot of records filed in our Secretary of State about loyalist claims, which can be helpful.
We have a question. My sister actually has been watching, so thank you, Sarah, for being here. She asks, Katie, you mentioned Farquhar. Do we know why he was giving information to both sides? Are there any biographies of Farquhar that we might understand why he's a double agent?
So as far as I know, there's not really an explanation given about why he was supplying both sides, but I will say he was an interesting figure. There is an article about him on NCpedia, which details that he just seemed to be really well connected to both sides. He had fought for the regulators at one point. He was a Scotsman, but then at the beginning of the war, he was also part of the Wilmington Committee of Safety, and he was appointed like one of the Patriot committees as well. Sons of Liberty, I think he was appointed there. So he really was well connected to both sides of the conflict. That maybe would explain it, where he probably knew a lot of people from both sides when they were camping there. But no official explanation was given. I do know he was one of the people that were captured after the battle, and he did get punishment for supplying information. Or I think they said his official, they found him guilty of assisting the enemy after the fact. So
thank you, Katie. And I will say we're getting close to 1 o'clock. We're going to keep try to answer the questions that have come in for a few minutes after, but if you need to leave, we completely understand. And the next question came in through the chat. Did the McLeods that die at Moores Creek come from Western North Carolina or from immigration near Cape Fear? Katie, do you know the origins of the McLeods at Moores Creek Bridge?
not Not from that specific for that specific question. I know more about the Donald McLeod, who I mentioned. He did come up from New England at the time, but I'm not sure about the origins of the other McLeods who were there during the battle. Yeah.
Again, I think the state library might be a good place.
Yeah, the
to
state
try to
library
find
probably
more
has some
information on
write-ups
that
for these
one.
people.
Let's see. Patrick says he noted the parallels between North Carolina and Virginia in a presentation. He has interest in the Northeast counties and links to Tidewater, Eastern District Minute Regiment, led by Colonel Edward Vale and Colonel House, 2nd North Carolina Regiment. And he's looking for recommendations on papers for that. So what I would recommend, Patrick, for that, please go ahead and send us that question through our email box, because we can look in our catalog and try to see what records might be relevant to your query. Our Allison or Katie, if you'll put the email address in the chat, so so Patrick can have it. We love to take reference questions through email, and in fact, they go to Allison. We would love to be able to help you with questions. There, the email is in the chat. So please send that one there, because that's going to require a bit more detailed research in our catalog to see what we might have relating to those regiments. But thank you for the question. The next one that came in, I think there was one in the chat. Yes, there's a couple more in the chat I want to make sure we get. Dan asks, wasn't there a meeting before the battle where the Loyalists thought they were 35 Patriots while the bulk majority were encamped somewhere else? So the Brits thought they were 35, and in the end, the Patriots brought 1,500. Katie, can you speak to this one?
Yes, because when I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty sure this question is referring to this moment where when I mentioned the Caswell's troops had camped on the west bank of the river, and it was a bad position, so they eventually left. They had left some campfires burning, and there were like some signs of life over there, but it wasn't like a 1,500 group of people. So they did the McLeod leading the battle did think that the camp was still there and like operating, so they did first go to the campsite specifically to try to ambush them. But then when they realized that it was empty, they decided to head towards the bridge to see if they had moved back that way. So that question may be referring to that moment. There was also a moment, I'm not sure if it was this exact like 35 Patriots, but there was a moment where Farquhar was giving intelligence about both sides. They did also think that there wasn't that many Patriots before Farquhar Campbell told them it was a bigger force. So that could have also been that moment that you're referring to. And that's why McDonald decided not to engage them beforehand on like the 20th. And instead, they went down towards Morse Creek.
Thank you, Katie. The next question came in through the chat, and it's in the Q&A. When MacDonald called the Whigs traitors to the Constitution, was he referring back to a British document, because the American Constitution doesn't exist yet? Allison or Katie, do either one of you want to take that one?
Pretty much, yes. It was he was referring to a different constitution.
Yeah, Britain doesn't have a written constitution per se, but it's a constitution in the sense of they refer to the entirety of their common law as a constitution.
Yes.
Yeah. So
not like the July 1776 Constitution. No.
And it's not a specific document. It's like it's against the sense of like a British parliamentary procedure, British British legal precedent, that sort of thing. In fact, the Britain would still say they have a constitution, but there's not a written constitution in the Crown Archives in London that's the same as what we have at the National Archives here. So thank you for that question. The next question that's come in, and it is after 1 o'clock, so we thank you for staying it past if you're still here. This is a big one for Allison is typing an answer for this. Christine asks, if they appear in Outlander, how accurate is the series? Allison and I have actually been doing a blog for years about comparing Outlander to North Carolina. Allison, while you speak to this, I'm going to go dig the link up for the blog so I can put it in the chat for Christine.
Sure. Yeah. The short answer to that is I think that the television show, I mean the books as well, the general plot of Outlander concerning the committees of safety that's being led by the Brown family, that's a little more personal. I think what's going on there with the Frasers, they were and they did employ intimidation against the neighbors that they felt like needed to be put on warning. They didn't use violence in their methods, but I think that in Outlander, the Brown family, who's heading up the Rowan Committee of Safety, is probably a little bit more violent, a little more personal against the Fraser family. But Outlander, the research that has been done for that particular series is just, I think it's great. Diana Gabaldon has done a lot of really good research on North Carolina during that time where she's placed her characters in North Carolina and that area. Jamie Fraser, was at the Battle of Morse Creek in the Outlander plot. So you do have the residents of Fraser's Ridge in Rowan County at the Battle of Morse Creek. So, but yeah, I think maybe for the drama of a fiction, maybe they're a little bit more violent, but in the series. But no, the history that I think in that series has been very well done, the research.
Thank you, Allison. And I put the link into the chat. We've covered a lot of different topics on our Outlander blog series, from things like Governor Tryon to committees of safety to newspapers to estates, a lot of different things that show up in the show and the books. So please check that out. We'd love for you to read it.
Mhm.
The last two questions are probably a bit more specific than what we can answer here. I just want to briefly mention them because you have been waiting so long. Steve, our attendee from Wales, asks, he said that originally there were 11 Welsh-born, or the original Wikipedia entry for the battle said there were 11 Welsh-born men in the Patriot militia. This has since been deleted, and he wonders if whether this claim has shown up elsewhere. I haven't seen it personally. It doesn't mean it's not true or it doesn't happen, but I haven't seen it personally. I think the best bet for that one, I know this is probably going to take some time, is to do some genealogies of the men listed in since we mentioned earlier, there are lists of men who we know were at Morse Creek, and try to find some genealogies of them. Again, the state library has published family genealogies for a lot of folks. So I think, Steve, I know you're in Wales, so you can't just come to Raleigh, but I think it might be worth sending the state library an email and seeing if they might be able to help you with some of the genealogies of these guys to see if any of them can be traced to Wales. But certainly, and if you come across any specific that you'd like us to see if we have records for in the archives, we would be happy to see if we have those for you. But I wish you the best on your continued research. And then John and Lauren Corbett are asking about the exact location of Corbett's Ferry. We showed Cross Creek Road and Newbern Road crossing, as well as other old maps from Sampson County Historical Society do not show the roads crossing. Can anyone locate the roads today? Lauren replied with a post on Find a Grave that may help with this a little bit. I will say that trying to match road locations then to road locations now or locations anywhere now is difficult. If you've done any research on using land records or any kind of road records that are from the colonial era or 19th century, the markers they're using to show where things are things like the stump on Josiah's property or the large rock at the fork. And that can be difficult to trace to a modern location because they're not using latitude, longitude addresses, anything like that. It is possible, but it takes honestly years of meticulous research. Again, there are some secondary resources that have tried to map older maps and older grants to modern locations. And maybe there is one for Corbett's Ferry. Katie, you unmuted. Maybe you know of one.
You may want to try to contact the Morse Creek National Battlefield. I was scrolling their website to see if they had any information about it, and it seems that they do mark a specific place called Historic Black River Road where they say like the crossing was. I'm not sure if this is exactly right, but they may have more specific information about that since they're in the area and have done some really in-depth research there.
Thank you, John, for the question. And again, we would love to help you with this research if you wanted to reach out to the archives or the library. I think that we can probably help you some more there. So thank you so much to everyone. I think that answers each question we've had come in. In the chat, it's just been comments. So thank you so much about that. Thank you all for staying here through the questions. Please feel free to come to the State Archives and continue this research. We encourage you to go down to Moores Creek itself next week for the 250th anniversary. We will have a one-day wonder there, which includes original records. So you'll get a chance to see some records in person down at Moores Creek Bridge. Diana Gabaldon will also be there if you're an Outlander fan. So please go down there. Reach out to us soon. You will receive the link for this, I believe, soon, or at least it'll be in our YouTube page. We cannot thank you enough for joining us, and we hope to see you again, either in the search room or at our next America 250 activity. Thank you all so much and have a great day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very
Thanks.
much. Bye-bye.
Bye.